So let me just start by saying hi to everyone. Happy Sunday. Richard and I were talking about how you think you can take a short break from news. And sure enough, there's something every day. And most recently, it's about this agreement, this 28-point agreement. And Richard, I have to confess, and I don't know how you all feel, I am not super read in on this. I kind of know in broad strokes what's going on, but I thought you could tell, sort of explain everything because this seemed, maybe I'm wrong, but it kind of seemed to come out of nowhere.
Well, actually, Katie, there's a big debate over where it came out of. Um, the Secretary of State, also known as the National Security Advisor, also known as the head of the archives, and I think he's got one other job, Marco Rubio, was meeting with some senators, and they came out of the meeting saying he told them it was Russian originated. He then denied it. The idea that someone might think it was Russian origin, shall we say, is not a stretch because it's an incredibly one-sided Russian agreement. These 28 points, then there's an annex to them. And just to make it even more complicated, as of a few hours ago, there's a European response to the 28-point plan, which works from it, but adds a few and takes away a few. So it ain't simple.
It's a hot mess. Well, can you start at the beginning of sort of everything that kind of happened, what this agreement entails, and then we'll talk about your view of it.
Okay. Well, let's play it straight down the middle. This kind of came out of nowhere. Look, we're now 3.5 years into this phase of the war, of Russia's war against Ukraine. First phase was 2014, the Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea and parts of the east. You then, in February of 2022, the Russians invaded again. And since then, the Ukrainians, with American and European help, have largely fought them to a standstill. When that second phase of the war began almost 4 years ago now, Ukraine controlled roughly 80% of its territory. Today, it controls roughly 80% of its territory, and that's happened at enormous cost. Hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, the economic cost, millions of refugees, economies hammered. This is in some ways the worst, not in some ways, in every way, the worst war Europe has seen since the World Wars. So that's where we are. This administration came in, 9 or so months ago, and the president, as he constantly says, this war never would have happened on his watch. I don't know what leads him to believe that, but he says it. And he says he wants to bring about peace, which I think is great. Peace in principle. It all depends upon the terms. And what we've seen repeatedly, and what we saw this week, is the United States promoting various types of peace plans. We saw one, for example, a few months ago, or however long ago it was, when President Putin and Trump met in Alaska, and so forth. So this has been going on for some time. This latest 28-point plan, though, I don't think how any fair-minded observer, Katie, could say anything but it is tilted heavily towards Russia. It doesn't really ask anything of Russia. It promises Russia relief from sanctions if it accepts the peace plan. It promised them membership in the G8. It promises all sorts of U.S.-Russian economic cooperation in virtually every realm you can think of. From Ukraine, it places a significant cap on its armed forces, down from in the neighborhood of 1 million to 600,000. It does not allow Ukraine ever to join NATO. It does not allow NATO to station forces in Ukraine, and it would require Ukraine to cede legally Crimea and other parts of the east, including land that right now Russia doesn't even occupy. So it's a remarkably one-sided agreement for reasons, and we can talk about it. Are not I don't quite fathom why it is we continue to push an approach to this war, which essentially penalizes the victim and rewards the aggressor.
And so I've heard bits and pieces of this, Richard, and I heard that this 28-point plan was given to Steve Witkoff. Is that right? And then he gave it to the president, and then the president said, "This is my plan." I mean, do you know anything about the provenance of how this unfolded?
No, but I do love the word provenance, and
Thank you.
I like the way you say it, Madame Couric. It is
Thank you.
très
Merci
chic.
beaucoup.
It is très chic. No, the provenance, is much debated on Le Twitter and on other, sites. Le X. It's being debated as to the role of the vice president. So a name we haven't heard, Dan Driscoll, the Secretary of the Army, who's close to the vice president, the envoy, Steve Witkoff, the Secretary of State, also Jared Kushner, who in Florida was with Steve Witkoff meeting with the Russian official who seems to be carrying the ball. So I don't have a clear feel or understanding of how we got where we are. But in a funny sort of way, Katie, we are where we are. And what matters to me, though I'd like to know exactly what role the Russians had. But all I know is the administration has been promoting a document that, again, I don't think any fair-minded or knowledgeable observer could conclude anything but it's a major move in the direction of Russia.
And yes, and it sounds like a complete capitulation to their goals, right? And as you said, gives Zelensky virtually nothing, right?
Gives him nothing. Now, here's where it gets a little bit confusing. When it was originally put out a couple of days ago, not only did it give him nothing, but he basically was told initially, I gather, that it was a kind of take it or leave it or else, and he had a week to decide. This was his Thanksgiving bonus. There's been a lot of pushback in the United States from the chattering class, but also from Republicans on the Hill, a few of them, and also from Europeans. And the president initially seems to have backed off, saying, well, he's open to Ukrainian and European suggestions. And his goal is to get it wrapped up by Thursday, but that's not a hard and fast
Right.
deadline.
He said that in the last 2 hours, right? That
Well, he's also said, though, that he yet again criticized what he called the quote unquote leadership of Ukraine, which in some ways echoes a Russian point that they're not legitimate. And he's basically for never showing gratitude. Well, that, as you recall, as everyone will recall, was the motif of that infamous White House meeting where
right.
Zelensky was pulled on the carpet. Every time now, every other word out of his mouth now is thank you. Uh, so I don't know where that came from. What that did, though, in a funny sort of way, and there's one other aspect of the plan I should have mentioned. What the plan largely does is because it doesn't mention American support for Ukraine. It basically talks about assurances. Russia promises not to invade again or attack. Okay. And then the United States pledges, both in the 28-point plan and in the annex to it, to assurances to Ukraine's security. But when you read the fine print, there's an awful lot of caveats as to what would trigger the assurance, and there's no detail as to what the follow up would be on our part. So then when the president puts out on True Social the criticizing Ukraine's quote unquote leadership and all that, it once again undermines our reliability. So essentially, this one sided agreement asks Ukraine to put all of its security eggs in our hands. At the same time, we're raising questions about our reliability and fidelity.
Let's talk about the role of Europe in this. As you said, the EU started to make noise about this and said, "Not so fast. We need to get involved in any kind of negotiation." Um, Gosh, if I were a member of the EU, I would be rip shit about this because it basically, which is a nice word in addition to
It's another
provenance.
another technical. Katie, you continued after all these years. You impressed me more than ever.
Thank you. But I would be really worried and upset because obviously there's no accountability. This, in essence, despite the quote unquote assurances, Richard, excuse me, gives Russia a green light for to exercise this kind of aggressive behavior in other countries, does it not?
Well, it would reward it in Ukraine. Plus, even though this is quote unquote an enduring peace plan, there's no guarantee it would be. Because one of the things, while it caps Ukraine's military, just to give you one example, there's nothing in the 28-point plan that would prevent Russia from modernizing and increasing the size of its military. So Russia could get to a point where after a couple of years, it could then complete its goal, which is not just to control some of eastern Ukraine, but is to snuff Ukraine out as an independent country with deep ties to the West. So again, the Europeans are wildly upset about this. They're upset both over the process that they were cut out. They're upset over the substance. So earlier today, they put out their own response to this. So it was quite ingenious, quite artful. They took the 28 points and they used that. It was almost like they had it on their computer. Not almost. It's clear they had it on their computer. They kept as much as they could. So they could straight-facedly make the argument, well, we're working from and with the American plan. But then they changed a few critical things. They increased the cap, height of the cap, if you will, on Ukraine's military. There's no prohibition on Ukraine entering NATO. It doesn't talk about stationing your NATO forces in Europe, but it doesn't. I mean, it precludes stationing, but anytime you preclude stationing, it means you don't preclude exercising. So you could have temporary presence, presumably, of NATO forces in
What
Ukraine. And
about
most,
territory? The most important thing,
I
really.
was about to get to that. You read
Okay,
my mind.
sorry.
You read my mind. You're like Karnak the Magnificent. I guess that ages us when we refer to Karnak.
Yeah,
All the
little
Johnny
bit.
Carson fans. Yeah, the territorial thing is completely different. That's the biggest change. Essentially, rather than transferring territory, it essentially would be a ceasefire in place, and questions of territory would have to be negotiated between Ukraine and Russia. It's in some ways, it goes back in many ways to where the United States was several months ago, with a kind of ceasefire in place, no change in, the, if you will, to use a Middle Eastern term, final status of territory, and says this is something to be negotiated between Ukraine and Russia. I think that's probably the most significant departure uh, in this. Can I say one other thing?
Yeah, please.
I mean, just as a style of diplomacy, I want people to have a feel for just the magnitude of what we've done. What we have done is we've gone to this sovereign country that has been the victim of aggression and basically said, you've got to give up some of your territory, agree to all these long-term limits, depend on us, on our assurances, even though we've broken those assurances repeatedly in the past, or else. So this would be the equivalent in the Middle East if the president turned to Israel and said, look, you have to agree to a Palestinian state with the following borders. You have to evacuate the following settlements. You've got to redivide Jerusalem, accept this many Palestinian refugees, and so forth and so on. And by the way, or else, and you got a week to make up your mind. And if you don't do it, you can't count on U.S. support. And if any president of the United States ever said anything remotely as radical as that to Israel, there would be riots in the capital and around the country. That is what we're doing to Ukraine. Essentially presenting them with a fait accompli, dealing with existential issues of their security and future. So this, yeah, you said you hadn't been following this that closely the last couple of days. I know you follow it closely in general. This is an amazing departure. And what it says about American foreign policy and about our whole approach to countries that depend on us, I think is incredibly, to say it's worrying is my attempt at diplomacy.
Well, let me ask you, and we'll talk about the ramifications of this in a second. But Richard, there are a couple other things happening in the backdrop or in
Sure.
the background, if you will. One is there's a corruption trial
Right.
against Zelensky. Can you help me understand that and what is going on with that?
Yep. He has a somewhat difficult domestic position for several reasons, not new. One is he's been in office a long time. Elections have been postponed. And the argument is they have to be postponed so long as the war's going on. You don't have conditions, you can have a vote. Not everybody is thrilled with his conduct of the war. He is clearly a micromanager. And look, corruption, shall we say, is not unknown to Ukraine. It was a hallmark of Ukraine before the war, it continues to be a real problem. It is a systemic problem, and it taints President Zelensky. It taints his administration. And there are those who think, and I don't have evidence of this. Let me just put it out there, that it's no coincidence that this diplomacy is happening against that backdrop, simply because there may have been the thought that he is more vulnerable now and is in a less good position to push back. I can't speak to that, but it's a hell of a coincidence that this plan came out in this context.
Let's talk also about Russia and sort of the war itself. Has Russia significantly upgraded its drone capabilities? I'm pulling this out of my ass, Richard, because a friend of mine told me this, and that's all I know.
Excuse me, Katie, out of your derriere.
Thank you. But does that have anything to do with the timing of this?
I don't think that's true, though. What your friend told you is basically true. That Russia has upgraded its drone capabilities. Uh, Not clear to me where they got it from, but they got it. And I don't know who helped them from the outside or whether they recovered some Ukrainian drones, reverse engineered them. I don't know. But both sides have dramatically upped uh, their drone attacks, and Russia more broadly continues to wage attacks at an intense scale. But no, I think that's just part and parcel of Putin's confidence that time is on his side, that he's in a better position to outlast not just Ukraine, but more important, Ukraine's supporters in Europe and above all the United States.
So it might have made him bolder, right? Diplomatically, if he felt militarily he was in a better position, right?
Maybe, but again, I think the bigger thing that affects or influences his approach to diplomacy is more his sense of whether the United States is going to pull the rug out from under Ukraine. And to the extent he believes that that is likely to happen, he has zero incentive to compromise, to negotiate in good faith. He just continues to wage the war. And what he's got on his side is a population that's what? Three and a half, four times the size of Ukraine's. He's got a bigger defense, and he's got mass. As Clausewitz said, one of the important things in war is mass or scale. So Russia is they've got an ability to sustain this war. Now, ad infinitum, probably not. Energy prices are low, under $60 a barrel. Sanctions are still there to some effect, and so
Are
forth.
those
So
working, by the way, Richard? Are the sanctions working?
at the margins, I mean, are they work? If you define working as getting Russia to reconsider the essence of its policy, no. Are they putting some stress on Russia's economy? Absolutely, yes. But Russia gets enormous help from China. It still sells its energy to places like India and Turkey, a little bit to Europe. It has relations with North Korea and Iran. Who knows what Russia gets in return from them? My guess is they probably provide nuclear and missile help to both Iran and North Korea. I mean, Russia now, in some ways, much more than China. Russia is, to take 30 seconds back from this Ukraine focus, Russia's emerged as the principal revolutionary country of this era of history. It gets up every day in the form of Vladimir Putin and does more to challenge the architecture of this era, more than anyone, including China.
I want to know why this is happening now. It's a pretty stunning development, incredibly disconcerting for the world order, and we'll talk about the fallout on sort of globally what this means to our allies and to the US role in the world. But why now? Of course you've heard for years that Putin has something on Trump and but it seemed that there was some equilibrium that had been reached. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it just wasn't a lot of news coming out of this part of the world or big news. So I'm just curious, why all of a sudden is the
I mean,
United States doing this?
there's no clear trigger to this, Katie. This was cooked up. We're not sure exactly how. Most of the initial reporting suggested between Witkoff, possibly Jared Kushner, and the Russians. But some of that's disputed. Sorry about all the sirens
That's
from the
okay.
here in New York. So we don't know, but there's nothing that's going on the ground, if you will, that explains why this diplomatic initiative. Now, why the president suddenly got impatient, why he ginned up this big initiative, why it has this coloration to it, and that's important because that has implications for where we go from here. So, if the United States and Marco Rubio walked out of a meeting an hour or two ago saying that great progress had happened. So the question is, if we make a, are we prepared to make a big press? What is it again we're going to be promoting? I don't hear anybody talking about what we're going to do for Ukraine other than these paper assurances, for example, the provision of intelligence or military support. So I've got more questions than answers. And what I'm hoping is that the negative reaction that you've heard from me and you've read from and heard from others, and the Europeans have chimed in on all that, it's clearly taken the administration aback, which as an aside is shocking. People must be in a serious bubble in the administration if they're surprised by the reaction to this
Mhm.
28-point plan. It's quite stunning to me that anyone who's followed this at all over the last decade or so would be one iota surprised by this reaction. So again, that further raises questions about the people doing this diplomacy for the United States. But I don't think right now we have a great sense of where it's going to go, other than there seem to be a lot of moving pieces and a tremendous amount of confusion, to be generous. So one other thing, by the way, in this, sorry to go on so long. What
It's
surprised
okay.
me in the 28-point agreement was how much of an emphasis it was on rehabilitating Russia. A big chunk of the agreement had nothing to do with Ukraine. It was almost like, let's get done with Ukraine and let's focus on getting Russia into the G8 and dropping sanctions. And there's about and it lists all the economic activities we want to enter into with Russia, from rare earths to energy to infrastructure. It's like people are chomping at the bit for U.S. Russian economic relationship. There's also some really distasteful things in this that after, we would take some of the frozen Russian assets, which I think is a good thing, but then it would be used to build some infrastructure in Ukraine, and we would take half the profits of anything from that. As though we're going to try to make money. We're going to expect compensation for any security guarantees we give. It's almost as if American foreign policy continues to revolve around narrow economic goals rather than larger principles or statecraft.
Well, it's like a business deal, but that probably isn't that surprising given the way the Trump family has been operating in all these global hotspots, right, Richard? And benefiting and financially exploiting all these relationships. I mean, it's grotesque, but not all that surprising, is it?
Yeah, but I'm a little like the guy who keeps hitting his head against the wall or whatever and expects a different effect. Every time it happens, I'm taken aback. And I realize this makes me an old school innocent, but it's quite stunning to me that there's such an emphasis on things economic. And within that, there's such an emphasis, shall we say, on business. I find this it's unprecedented. I'll be honest with you. I find it distasteful in the extreme, but there it is.
So let's just look ahead. And so Donald Trump, President Trump,
Mhm.
has said they have that Zelensky has till Thanksgiving
Right.
to make a decision, right? Now he's kind of said, well, maybe I'll give it more time, right?
Right.
Maybe he's listening to the pushback or hearing about it.
Mhm.
So so what is the time frame here? And is there um any scenario in which Zelensky would say, "Mea culpa, I give up,
Yeah.
we're
He'd
gonna
be,
do this." So
he'd be
and if he doesn't, what happens?
okay. So I think right now the center of attention is on these talks between Americans, Europeans, Ukrainians, and Europe. There's some talk about Zelensky possibly or Europeans coming back to Washington in this coming week. Uh, at some point, my prediction is if you were to get a revised agreement that looks more like the European counter than the original 28 points, which is the only agreement Zelensky could ever agree to. Otherwise, he'd be a dead man in Ukraine. He would be, there's zero chance Ukrainians would allow him to sign an agreement that looked like this. And my guess is there's zero chance he'd be inclined to anyhow. So at the moment, I think it's what we used to call in high school math. Now I'm gonna see if you remember it. The null set.
Oh,
I'm not
yeah.
I'm not sure
Isn't
there's
that and this was the symbol.
very good, very good. You've been taking the memory medicine. Uh, but I think at the moment, it's hard for me to imagine, maybe my paucity of imagination. It's hard for me to imagine any counter text that Ukraine would say we can live with, that then Russia would say it can live with. So my guess is, to use my favorite word, the situation isn't ripe for diplomacy. So, so this attempt to jam Ukraine won't work. Hopefully, I literally think at the end of the day, Zelensky would say hell no rather than accept it. So I and if so, he won't be party to the 28-point plan, which Putin could live with. And I don't believe Putin would be party to any plan that the Europeans and Zelensky would sign on to. So again, I come back to the null set. I think that's where we are diplomatically. And if Mr. Trump wants peace in Ukraine, and I think he's right to want it, I just wish he'd revisit both his diplomatic approach, go for something simpler and cleaner, and second of all, make a long-term commitment to Ukraine. That's the only way to disabuse Putin of the confidence that time is on his side. So long as Putin thinks that we are short of breath, he will not make any meaningful compromises.
Do you think the Epstein files has anything to do with this?
Katie, I was hoping to get through a podcast without
I
hearing
know,
those
I'm
words.
sorry. But somebody actually who's watching said Epstein files Russian connection rumored.
Oh,
I don't know about that, but I'm wondering if he wants to change the subject.
yeah, I've gotten to the point, I don't know about you, where I've learned now not to assume anything and not to rule anything out. So I don't know. That's the honest answer. I can't tell you there's 0 chance that's a possibility. I just don't know. But sure,
Yeah,
that's something that, uh, yeah, I would just say again, I would hope, it's not true, but I'm not in the position to sit here and reassure
yeah.
you that something like that isn't happening or couldn't happen. I can't
You know,
reassure
you
you about much of anything anymore.
yeah, you said that the way to exert US power is to stand behind Ukraine. But Trump has had the opportunity to do this on numerous occasions, and he just never seems capable of being a steadfast and strong supporter of a country that was invaded by Russia.
In general, he's not a good steadfast supporter of allies. He tends to see, relationships much more transactional and what have you done for me today? And what are you gonna do for me tomorrow, particularly in the business and economic sphere, which is corrosive for alliances which are based on trust and predictability. Ukraine, he has a particularly negative feeling about Zelensky and company, which I think goes back to Biden and Zelensky not cooperating, producing information about Hunter Biden, all that. But he's had a he he's had this real negative take on. I nearly said something else, which would have been really bad. He's had a real negative take on this for some time, and JD Vance has doubled down on it. And so I can, so I can't say with confidence I'm right, but there's been a consistently harsh approach to Ukraine, and there's been a consistently soft tilt or what soft approach and a conscious tilt towards Vladimir Putin. I can speculate on both, but I don't. All I know is the policy that emerges from it is truly unfortunate, and ironically enough, it works against President Trump's stated goal of bringing about peace. He continues to sabotage his own his own objective.
So I want to close, Richard, with by kind of taking a step back and looking at the big picture. I feel like this almost sounds like a broken record at this point, but can you talk about how it has shifted sort of America's role in the world? This kind of, first of all, bizarre kind of it feels like I mean, you're the diplomat, Richard. I'm not, and you're the foreign policy expert. It seems so knee jerk and kind of out of left field and irrational, this kind of foreign policy maneuvering. But what impact is it going to have on on us globally? And I can only imagine. I don't know if you've talked to any world leaders, as this has unfolded, but um,
I do.
just give us sort of what this means, and if they're successful, if they're not successful, but even putting this proposal out there.
Well, let me say 2 things. One is to repeat a word I used before, it's corrosive. It's corrosive both of deterring our adversaries because they then lie around waiting for opportunities, and it's obviously corrosive for alliances because friends don't know they can depend on us. So everybody's watching this and everybody's taking note, and who knows what Putin will be encouraged to do, who knows what Xi Jinping in China will be encouraged to do, who knows, how this will affect the allies. And then I think secondly, it dramatically weakens American influence around the world. It makes the world, I think, a slightly more dangerous place. And what's happening, and I just traveled in the Middle East recently. I've taken 3 trips to Europe this fall. Essentially, what people are beginning to do is hedge against us. So, yeah, everybody's gotten good, if you will, at playing the president. Everybody knows, how to play up to him and be, extraordinarily complimentary and nominate him for the Peace Prize and this and that. But what they're all doing, what they've all got in their drawer of their desk is a hedge against American uncertainty. All of them are basically thinking of how do they either make deals with some of their enemies, how do they find new friends, how do they try to become more self-sufficient. But essentially, they're beginning to prepare for a world in which the United States plays much less of a role. And by the way, what we're doing in places like Venezuela, this kind of pivot to the Western Hemisphere, plays into that. There's a sense that the United States is obsessed with homeland security in a large definition, including the Western Hemisphere, and is moving away from Europe, moving away from the Middle East, and moving away from Asia. And that is the take of a lot of the world, that they are beginning to adjust and prepare themselves because also they're not confident of what comes after Donald Trump, whether it's another Republican or who knows what, but they no longer, after 80 or 75 years of assuming continuity, they no longer have that luxury. So in a funny sort of way, we're bringing about a post-American world, but it has yet to be defined, and I think that's the big issue that's going on, going on these days.
I know you told me before you're not an expert on Venezuela, but I know there's a lot of rumblings on Capitol Hill, talk about the War Powers Act,
Yep,
talking about whether or not, blowing up these
yep.
boats ostensibly carrying drugs is even legal. We don't have to get in sort of the whole of why Venezuela, but I mean, what do you make of what is going on there, Richard?
I think it has almost nothing to do with blowing up the boats. That's a small side issue, and it's a legal issue and all that about the fact that these attacks are taking place without due process and all that. I think what's going on, Katie, is not that complicated. I don't think you have to be an expert. I think the United States wants to bring about regime change in Venezuela. The reasons are we want to stop the emigration. About 8 million people have left. We want to stop the drug processing that's going on there. Venezuela holds the world's largest oil reserves, tremendous economic opportunity there. And I can imagine this administration sees American companies getting back into a post Maduro Venezuela, and the government will get a 10 or 20% stake. Not an inconceivable. So what they're doing
Those
is they're
business dealings entering the picture again.
100%, 100%. And what they've done, it's almost like old-fashioned British gunboat diplomacy. They've amassed a lot of gunboats, including, an aircraft carrier and associated ships. And the question is whether that presence, possibly with some covert action, possibly with some limited strikes, whether this can set in motion a chain of events that would bring about the ouster of this regime. Maybe. The problem is once you start, what happens if you don't succeed? Do you escalate? And then the problem is also if you succeed, what then? How do you make sure a vacuum of power doesn't come about in which you have gangs and all sorts of other groups gain a foothold? So we are in the early stages of what could be, in some ways, a really ambitious foreign policy enterprise. What's so ironic here is you have half of MAGA loving it because of the Homeland Security part, and half of it hating it because it could represent a major commitment and involvement. So I think the administration is trying to figure out what it wants to do next, but they are potentially embarking on a extraordinarily difficult and risky and uncertain enterprise.
And in so many ways, Richard, is antithetical to the kind of isolationist tendencies that Trump ran on, right?
Right, with the partial exception that if you see Venezuela and some of these other places, less as foreign policy concerns, but because of immigration and drugs and oil, more as domestic concerns. So it becomes more of an extension of domestic policy than a pure foreign policy play. But you're right 100%. There's a tension there between the mind your knitting, let's stay at home, let's not get involved in foreign wars, and what we're on the edge of possibly doing there. So I think that's one of the reasons that the administration's not quite sure how to proceed.
Really strange times we're living in, Richard, but thank you so much for helping us at least understand what the
Thanks.
hell is going on, even if we still are left scratching our heads in
Will you,
terms of,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I just in terms of like the why of it all, right?
Yeah. Look, it's important times. And let's go back to where we began. We were both hoping to take a few days off, and it's hard. And you look at all that's going on domestically, all that's going on internationally, and it's hard to kind of shut down it, even though it's necessary. Would you do me one other favor? Would you tell people where to go to read about this?
Oh, yes, yes. Richard has a Substack and he has a weekly, but in this case, twice a week because he had to update. He comes out on Friday, sometimes on Thursday, mostly on Friday. It's called Home and Away, and it's Richard's take on what's happening internationally. And it's a great thing to read. So definitely subscribe to Richard's Substack. Um, he's I don't know, whenever there's a foreign policy issue, I always reach out to Richard. I was thinking my second person I reach out to is Mike McFall, and I can only imagine, Richard, what Mike McFall is thinking about these latest developments with Ukraine.
I think as someone who he served as ambassador to Russia, I think shocked, not actually not shocked, more just dismayed, angry. You read his posts. And I think that's true of most, by the way, of the foreign policy hands. If you kind of look at what people are putting out there, there's almost nobody, and this is Democrats, Republicans. There's almost nobody who's defending what we're doing, and for good reason. I'm sorry to say.
Well, on that happy
Oh,
note, you
how
guys,
about Happy Thanksgiving?
happy Thanksgiving, everyone. I'm going to try to take a break. My daughter's coming with my grandson and her husband tomorrow, and my other daughter's coming, and Jay, John's parents are coming, and so anyway, I'm excited. Where are you looking forward to Thanksgiving?
Yeah, we're going to be invaded. I think the latest count was either 24 or 26 for
Oh my
Thanksgiving
gosh,
dinner. Uh,
is Susan cooking?
I do the turkeys basically. I smoke a turkey. We do 2 turkeys. We roast one and we smoke one. And then there's about 600 trimmings, great stuffing, and just about everything. No one goes home hungry. And some of the guests bring things, and the only problem is I'm usually in charge of cleaning up. So
Oh,
that's usually and with this many people, it'll probably take me till Saturday to
I
finish.
was going to say you should get some help from some of those youngsters who are going to be joining you. Richard, thank you.
Take care, Katie. Be well, be safe, be healthy.
Okay, and thanks everyone for watching. Hope this was helpful and we'll keep you posted on what's happening in that part of the world.